Hello everyone, my name's Anthony. I'm one of your SIs for Bio 5B, and today I'll be teaching you guys about muscles and nutrition. This corresponds to lecture 14 and 15 from Dr. Joseph's lectures. So let's go ahead and get started with lecture 14. Lecture 14 is going to talk about muscles and movement. But in order to talk about how muscles are moving and how they're contracting, you first need to talk about the nervous system. Both the nervous system and the musculatory system are tightly interwoven, and that is because the nervous system is what is ultimately controlling those motor functions. And so what this is the central nervous system broken down. It's a CNS breakdown. It's probably a different kind of breakdown than you're used to. And so what we're going to focus on is how these different CNS and PNS are comprised. So starting off, the central nervous system is comprised of your brain and spinal cord. So they're the main control. It's what's doing the processing. So your brain and spinal cord are the main components. And then coming off of them or on the side or the periphery, right, the PNS, that is your peripheral nervous system. And those are composed of nerves and ganglia. And so there are two different kinds of nerves in your PNS, both afferent and efferent, that are really important, and they're often very much confused. And so kind of a mnemonic to help me memorize them and how I learn them is that afferent neurons, afferent nerves, are taking things and arrive at the central nervous system. So they're taking information and they arrive at the brain and spinal cord. That must mean that they're taking things from external and internal places, so either the senses or body temperature or some form of homeostasis, and they're taking all that information and they're arriving at the central nervous system, so therefore it must be afferent. So then at the central nervous system, your brain and spinal cord are going to do processing, and they're going to look at all the information that was brought in that has arrived, and then they're going to have some kind of response. And they have to take that information to create a response or the response it wants to generate. And to do that, it uses efferent neurons. And these are neurons that exit the central nervous system, taking a response to the muscles. You have two different kinds of muscles. You have those that are voluntary. So the motor system is a voluntary muscle, so that if you want to bend your arm, you can bend your arm voluntarily. However, you also have autonomic muscles that people often don't consider. And so they take the form of many different kinds, like circulation and digestion, right? You don't control your heartbeat voluntarily. It does it automatically. Therefore, you have both voluntary and autonomic functions. So as we just talked about a lot of the nervous system and a lot of the neurons that are involved in this pathway, you might be considering how this relates to the musculatory system. And so the whole point of this is that the nervous system is what's ultimately controlling the musculatory system. And there are three different types of muscles that we're going to focus on, three different types of muscle tissue. And they are the skeletal, smooth, and cardiac tissue. One of which, the skeletal, is voluntary, right? So that's under the motor system. It's involved in locomotion. It's essentially how you're bending your arm. And the other two, smooth and cardiac, are involuntary, meaning we don't have control over them. And that's probably a good thing, because if you did have control over them and you forgot to digest or you forgot to beat your own heart, it would mean you're in a lot of danger. So the first one we're going to talk about is the skeletal muscle tissue. And as I previously said before, again, just emphasizing the fact that this is a voluntary movement. So this is things that we consciously are able to move. And then if we're going to look at the specific type of tissue, what this tissue looks like, the most important part is that it looks striped or it's striated. And so you can see that in this diagram, the red, the bright red tissue right here, you can see those striated striped marks. Another thing that you guys need to understand about the skeletal muscle tissue is its composition, so how it's formed. So at the very base level, its smallest subunits, there two different kinds of filaments. There's the thick filament, which is myosin, and then there's the thin filament, which is actin. And together, actin and myosin, they form a sarcomere. The sarcomere forms a myofibril, and then the myofibril forms a myocyte. And altogether, that's going to eventually lead to the muscle tissue. And so one of the things that I'm going to point out that we'll get to later is that it's really important that you know that actin has tropomyosin, and that'll be really important for regulation of contraction. So that's one of the components that's also on actin. And then last thing to consider, the skeletal muscle is moved through the sliding filament model. So this model, its main idea, the big idea from this model, is that the actin is what's contracting inward toward the M line, which is basically the middle. So the M line is the middle, and it's contracting inward. Dr. Joseph does a really good job of explaining this, and he goes really in depth, so I'll go ahead and let you guys review his video for how the sliding filament model works. So next up, we have the smooth muscle. So the first thing to talk about is that, again, these are involved in involuntary movements. We don't have control over the digestive tract or the secretory tract. It's not something we consciously think about, and it's not something we do voluntarily. Another thing to look at, again, is the muscle structure. And if you look at this tissue type, the structure is very smooth. I like to think of it as a little more curvaceous or wiggly, and they bend. If you look at it, there's like a curve, kind of like waves within this tissue. The next thing to talk about is that there are no discrete synapses, and it's controlled by that autonomic nervous system. So if you remember the breakdown, it's kind of the reason we went over that breakdown, is so that you realize that this muscle tissue is controlled by that system. It's very tied, closely involved with that nervous system. It's resistant to fatigue, and that's good, and it's very slow. Both of these have a purpose in that if you got fatigued very quickly while doing the digestive tract, it would be extremely problematic. As well as if it were to go too fast, you wouldn't have the opportunity to extract as much nutrients as you would if it were to move slowly through that digestive tract. And the last thing to know is that there are 2 layers of cells there, and they alternate between circular and longitudinal muscle. And the last type of muscle that we have is cardiac. And this one, again, is involuntary, which is a very, very good thing. And that's because, again, you don't want to have to consciously think about beating your heart all the time. The next thing is that it has a very specific type of cell shape. And if you look at the cells, again, it's column cells, but what's really special about these is that they branch. So see these branch points between the different columns? That's what they mean by branched. Another thing to consider is that there are pacemakers, and these generate those electrical signals that coordinate the heartbeat. It's what maintains your heartbeat, and people who have problems with this get an artificial pacemaker. The muscle, again, it isn't necessarily voluntarily controlled, but it is still regulated by neurons and hormones, right? In times of fight or flight, when you're getting really stressed out, that's also controlled by the autonomic nervous system. Your heartbeat increases, right? So that's why it was under the autonomic nervous system. It's your heartbeat's faster, you're trying to pump more blood, get more oxygen to those muscles. And the last thing is that, very important, it's fatigue resistant. You don't want your heart failing on you. That'll be cardiac arrest, right, when your heart gives out and it's no longer able to pump. So it's really important that it resists fatigue. So first off, we're going to talk about how the action potential is coming from a motor neuron, right? That is the nervous system, and it releases acetylcholine onto the muscle tissue. And so this is an instance, this is the connection between the nervous system and that muscle tissue. And again, if you're trying to like keep up and keep track of all these things, this is a signal coming from the central nervous system, and it's exiting the central nervous system. Therefore, it must be an efferent neuron. And then the action potential is then transferred in the muscle. So the muscle cell from acetylcholine generates an action potential within it. That action potential moves along the membrane and eventually goes through what's called a T-tubule until it reaches what's called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And inside the sarcoplasmic reticulum, it normally, under non-action potential conditions, is continuously storing calcium. So think of them as a really big calcium bank. Upon an action potential, when that action potential comes across the membrane and down the T-tubule and it generates that, this is a stimulus to release all of that calcium that had been stored inside the sarcoplasmic reticulum and release that into the cytoplasm. So that's what's happening here. That's the main connection. What you're seeing in this diagram, the first half, is the connection between the action potential from a neuron entering that of that muscle tissue. So on to step number 4. So as I just had said, the sarcoplasmic reticulum had released large amounts of calcium from within it into the cytoplasm. And all this calcium is now swimming around. And as if you remember from the sliding filament model that we had talked about in terms of contraction, this calcium plays a very important role. What's going to happen is that this calcium shown in green, those little dots, is that they're going to bind to what's called tropomyosin on actin filaments. And this is where students get really confused as well. I would like to clarify to you that tropomyosin is on actin. It is a blocker that blocks myosin from binding to actin. So even though it is called tropomyosin, it's found on the actin filament and prevents that myosin from binding. So upon calcium binding to tropomyosin, the actin filament, this myosin binding site is now revealed. So it changes the shape of the filament, and now it's revealing where myosin can bind. So the fifth step is, now that there is this binding site that's been revealed from calcium binding, the myosin will go ahead and bind and perform that sliding filament model contraction, like the standard one that you'd previously been talked about. In step number 6, so this is how the contraction occurs. So then myosin can bind, you perform the contraction, but then you also need to stop the contraction. Like, you can't have contraction the whole time. And so when the neuron stops its action potential, when it stops releasing that acetylcholine, calcium will again start being pumped right back into those banks, the sarcoplasmic reticulum where it was being stored. And calcium again starts entering the sarcoplasmic reticulum from the cytoplasm, which eventually it'll unbind from tropomyosin, and that tropomyosin again will block the myosin binding sites. So again, at low calcium, at number 7, tropomyosin is blocked, and there could be no interaction between myosin and actin. And that is how you do a contraction and inhibit contraction after a contraction action potential has been created. So those are the main things that I wanted you guys to take away from the muscle and movement section. And now let's talk about lecture 15, which is the nutrition and digestion section. So just some last things that I think are really important that I wanted to talk about that students get often confused about, and I just want to clarify. The first being essential nutrients. So essential nutrients are those that cannot be made by the cells. So I want to be very clear in what they mean by essential. That's why it's underlined. Oftentimes students get confused in what they think essential means, that they need it, right? However, these cells, they all need amino acids. Every single one is needed, right? So essential doesn't necessarily mean needed. In this case, what essential is referring to is, it means, can you produce this material? Are you able to have the cell produce it, or do you need to take it from outside sources, having it being produced by someone else? And so what they mean by essential is that they cannot make it themselves, and they have to take it in from the outside. And last but not least, Dr. Joseph went through all the food processing. I think it was really in depth, and I just want to talk a little bit more about the adaptations, because I think those are really important. So the first being the symbiotic bacteria, and that's something we use, it's something that animals use, and that's an interaction, a symbiotic mutualism where both people benefit, both the host and the bacteria benefit, and the benefits can be seen here. The host is providing that bacteria food and shelter, so it's getting an immediate source of food, it's always continuous, they know they have a reliable food source, and they have shelter from pathogens. And in exchange, what the bacteria is providing is that they're providing nutrients that the host isn't able to produce themselves. So again, remember when we were talking just a second ago about essential nutrients and how we can't produce all of them and we have to take them up? Well, a symbiotic bacteria might be able to produce a nutrient that we weren't able to produce ourselves. And so we rely on these bacteria to help produce some of those essential nutrients. Another one that I think is really cool is gut length, and that's seen in koalas, or specifically all herbivores. And that's when you have a longer small intestine and cecum, and that's to aid in digestion and give you more time to break down those materials that are more difficult to break down. So plant material that herbivores are primarily consuming is a lot harder to break down, and so they have to have longer intestines and the cecum to aid in that digestion. And the last one is something that you guys have all heard about when you've heard of ruminates. So that is a cow, essentially. Like, cows are a prime example of ruminates, and they have what's called a rume, which is a special foregut, which provides that extra fermentation process that aids in digestion and food processing as well. And with that, I think I've hit all the key points that I wanted to talk about more in depth and clarify for you guys. If you have any more questions or comments, go ahead and leave them in the comment section on this YouTube video below, or you can come visit our office hours and talk to us and ask us questions in person. We always love to have you guys there. Feel free to let us know if you have anything else you would like us to cover or want us to talk about in more in depth. Thanks for watching.